Okay, as promised, I want to give you some feedback on the March 2026 SBL exam, going through the questions and suggesting how you may have dealt with those questions. The pre-scene, if you're familiar, was on Mercer, which is a publishing company. And the questions which I'm going to go through are all of the questions that were set. Just to remind you, SBL is taken all around the world at different times of the day, on the day of the exam. And therefore, there is not just one exam, there are various variants of the exam. I know what all of these variants contained because I have students who are all over the world, from China to Australia to Malaysia to Ireland to Switzerland. So all the different variants I'm aware of, and that is what I am going to talk to you. So you're not just going to look at 3 exam questions, you're going to see all of the exam questions. And you may not have got all of these exam questions. You might have hoped you did, but just so you can see how the examiner's mind is working. And also, in the interests of fairness, although I knew what was on the exam on the day of the exam, I haven't released any of this information until all of recit papers and other kind of papers have been finished. So there's no advantage anyone gets to this other than understanding what, or no unfair advantage other than understanding what is in SBL. And if you've not taken SBL before and you're looking at it, it will hopefully give you a good insight into the type of questions that come up. Yep. So thank you to my students who have shared with me their exam experiences, and I'm feeding that back to them through this video. And hopefully, if you are looking at doing SBL, this may also be helpful to you. After this review, I'll also share with you topics I included in my mock exams to see how close what we did in the mock was to what came in the actual exam. Okay, so let's continue. So the first question we got was a question on leadership, and this question was asking, what are the qualities of a good leader? To be honest, this was straight out of your studies, but you needed to make sure it was in the context of a publishing company. Answers that just talked about different leadership styles in a theoretical sense wouldn't have got any marks at all. If you were to use any theory that probably helps, probably something like the Ashridge management styles, your tell, sells, joins and consults would have helped you here. And hopefully you would have swayed towards a leadership style which is more collaborative and democratic. That would be a modern style. You would have talked about how a leader would set the tone at the top. They would influence culture. They would drive change. They'd be a good communicator. They would, what else would they do? They would have empathy with their workforce. So, anything along those general styles in the context of Mercer would have got you some good marks. Important to make sure that the answer you gave was well laid out and reflective of the marking scheme. So that should have been fairly good and fairly broad in how you could have answered it. The next question was in the area of corporate governance, and it was asking how induction, board appraisal of the whole board and of individuals and CPD would help with performance enhancement for directors. And there was also a question some got about issues with NEDs, issues of long service, so no rotation, no experience of NEDs, the problems with committees and the composition of those committees. So I think the key thing here, if you'd studied corporate governance, that should have been all right for you, but it would be important that you broke down the question, whichever one you got, into its various components. You looked at the marking scheme and you made sure your answer coverage was reflective of the marks awarded. I think if you had covered this well in your studies, this again should have been fairly straightforward, and mark focus would have tripped some people up. For my students, if I remind you, we went through a mind map specifically on the board of directors, what their role was. We talked about NEDs, we talked about chairmans. If you were basically familiar with how we took all that apart and we annotated and went through it, I think that would have given you most of the knowledge you need to pass this particular question. So, not a bad question, if you got it. There was then a question on stakeholders. This was another nice question. It was asking about the benefits of voluntary reporting in the wider range of stakeholders using integrated reporting. Now, we talked about this quite a lot on the course, and if you were able to apply it in the context of publishing stakeholders, you would have done really well. 6 capitals would obviously be a good catalyst to get you thinking in the right way, but if you just regurgitated the 6 capitals, that wouldn't have got you any marks, and you needed to use something like the 6 capitals as a catalyst to structure rather than use it as an academic regurgitation. Yeah, had you done that, you wouldn't have scored very well. Had you talked about the stakeholders and also made sure that you framed them in benefits. Yeah, why would it be beneficial? What would it do? That would have got you the marks. So a nice question for a well-prepared student. Next question was talking about strategy. In particular, it was in the area of strategic choice, and it was asking you to evaluate the purchasing of another publishing company which was overseas. So if you're familiar with this areas of the syllabus, when we get to strategic choice and when we're evaluating strategic choice, I would encourage you to think whether the deal on the table is suitable. So when we say, is it suitable? We're thinking of, does it kind of complement the current business? We're thinking, is it feasible? So I talk about the 6 M's, the money, the manpower, the materials, the machinery, the markets, the makeup. Is it feasible within the context of our resource positioning, which if you use 6 M's helps extend your answer quite well. And then we're thinking about, is it acceptable? So it has to be acceptable to the key stakeholders. Would they be happy about this? So in the context of publishing, you're looking at shareholders, you're looking at maybe key employees. However, had you seen, it's evaluation of choice, suitable, feasible, acceptable, you weren't actually answering the question as it was asked. The question as it was asked was asking for benefits and drawbacks, and the highest scoring marked answers would have framed it in the terms of benefits and drawbacks. But the catalyst of suitability, feasibility, and acceptability would have created for you some benefits and drawbacks. So reading the question carefully, having good catalysts would have got you a good mark there. There was a question on technology where it was talking about the benefits and problems of digitization, also with links to e-marketing. Here, knowledge of the benefits of technology through maybe knowledge on big data, also drawbacks of big data, wrapped in the context of publishing, would have done well there. In terms of e-marketing, if you understand about the 6 I's and were able to talk about them in the context again, you would have done well on this question. So again, in the context, catalyzed by some academic theory, but that academic theory would not be revealed. We then had a question on risk, and there was quite a lot of information on risk in the pre-scene. And again, it would be important to diligently go through those risks, assessing them, and then suggesting again in the context of a publishing company how we might mitigate them. Yep, so that should have been fine. There was then a question in the area of professional ethics, and this was a nice question on bribery and evaluating whether the actions were appropriate to deal with what was going on. So yeah, you need to remain professional in your view there, but you should have been able to handle that. We then had quite a bit in the pre-scene talking about social responsibility, talking about environmental standards, and it was no surprise that there was a question on social and environmental issues, and it was basically about 3 different paper suppliers, different standards, and the impact that might have. Yep. You should have been okay. Certainly if you went through my pre-scene discussion, you would have been fine. So you might think, okay, that was the exam. The mocks that we did, let me remind you of the mocks that we did, those of us who were on the course with me, what we covered on those mocks, and to see how helpful they would have been to our exam. So we did a March revision mock where our question 1 talked about the qualities of leadership. You might recognize that coming up in a real exam. We talked about outsourcing. Now, outsourcing was an evaluation of whether outsourcing is good or not. So in the real exam, there was an evaluation of an acquisition, but and whether you evaluate outsourcing, whether you evaluate internal growth, whether you evaluate a joint venture, it still comes down to, is it suitable, feasible, acceptable? So that should have helped. There was a project management question we did in the revision mock. There was nothing in the exam on that. Talking about structure could have lent a little bit to leadership, but there wasn't anything specific on organisational structure. Review of risks and mitigating activities, there was a question on that. And there was a question on cybersecurity and controls. So I made you do questions there. I made you look at those questions in the context of time, in the context of layout, mark focus, professional skills. So that should have helped. We then did a further pre-scene mock where I included the benefits and drawbacks of outsourcing. I thought maybe the cost of printing was going up, the volume of magazines being publishing was going down. Maybe we could save some money by outsourcing. So although the question wasn't on outsourcing, it was on acquisition. I then thought, because we have got magazines at different stages in their life, there could be something talking about the portfolio linked to maybe the BCG matrix. There wasn't anything on that, unfortunately, but we were fully aware of it through the pre-scene mock. Evaluation of stakeholders, now integrated reporting can help. There was exactly a question exactly on that, so you should have been okay. KPIs for stakeholders and why security needs attention and what we need to do. There was also a question in the area of technology and the problems and security. Yep, so you should be happy. We did a question on unethical behaviour of plagiarism, and we talked about the management action of unethical behaviour on plagiarism. There wasn't a question on plagiarism unethical behaviour, but there was a question on unethical behaviour on bribery. So again, everything we talked about, the feedback we gave, should have been really useful to apply it in the context of bribery as opposed to plagiarism. As with all my pre-scene mocks, I give extra questions because I think, we don't just narrow it down to 3. So we did a question on corporate governance, board diversity and capability. We did a question on change management using an exhibit. So there wasn't anything on change management, but there was a question on corporate governance. There was a question on e-marketing. I did an additional one in the context of publishing on e-marketing. I did an additional question on EMAS, so this linked to the social responsibility question. And I did a question on digital strategy. And I also did a question on big data linked to digital strategy. So we reviewed them, we went through them, we thought about how we would answer them. They were all very, very useful. Let me just remind you again, in case you've forgotten, what came up in the actual exam. A question came up on leadership. A question came up on corporate governance and board diversity. A question came up on stakeholders and integrated reporting. A question came up on evaluation of a strategic choice. A question came up on technology, on e-marketing. A question came up on risk and mitigation of risk. And a question came up on professional ethics. And a question came up on social responsibility. Of maybe the 3 or 4 exam variants, They were the questions that came up on all of those exams. So had you gone through my mocks, had you gone through my pre-scene mock, looked at my additional pre-scene questions, did we do a question on leadership? Yes, we did. Did we do a question on corporate governance and board diversity? Yes, we did. Did we do a question on stakeholders and integrated reporting? Almost exactly the same one. Did we do a question on evaluation of strategic choice? Well, we did a question evaluating outsourcing, but the principles of evaluating acquisition were the same. So yes. Did we do a question on technology and e-marketing? Yes, we did. Almost the same. Did we do a question on risk and risk mitigation? Yes, we did. Did we do a question on professional ethics? Well, we didn't talk about bribery, but we talked about plagiarism. So we were well prepared for a question on professional ethics. Did we do a question on social responsibility? I did a question on EMAS, but the things we talked about in how we would answer that was similar to the knowledge needed to talk about, the different papers. So that was good. So you should be proud of yourself for being well prepared. Just remind you and a few things about SBL. This is particularly for those people who might be watching this having not taken an SBL exam. Those of my students, remember that it's not a technical exam. It is an exam that you're not able to learn and regurgitate theory. Yeah, you need to understand it. Yep, you need to apply, in this case, in the context of a publishing company. Yep, so please remember that. I know other exams you've done before require a lot of theoretical stuff. This hardly requires any. Yep, so how is it different? The difference is the rationale of the exam. Yeah, look at what the examining team say. It's a practical work-based exam. Yep, so it's technical knowledge in the application of being a strategic leader. It's in the context of the workplace, and you need to make sure you use professionalism and use the professional skills marks as the lens through which you look through it. If you do all that, the exam's going to be absolutely fine. Remember, it doesn't seem that difficult. Oh, I can do that. Lots of people, I can do it on my own. Good luck. If you can, good luck. I certainly couldn't when I was a student, but if you think you can, that's fine. But I would respect it, because why people tend to fail SBL is for the following reasons. And they tend to fail it through poor timing. They tend to fail it through poor layout. They tend to fail it through poor mark focus. They don't fail it due to poor technical knowledge. Yep. But what they don't do is get feedback and help and insight into how to apply that technical knowledge. They don't do enough practice. They don't get enough feedback. Please make sure you do that so you pass this first time and you do away with exams forever. If this is your last exam and you're feeling quite smug at this moment because you think you did very well, or if you are a student who as maybe, looking at this, looking forward to doing the SBL exam, I wish you all the very best of luck. If you need any help, any insight, just get in touch and I'll get right back to you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you found it useful.